Welcome to the Neurocrush Immersion. In this podcast, we're going to talk about the brain and happiness. What would your life be without emotions? To appreciate the significance of emotions, just imagine life without them. Instead of the daily highs and lows we experience, life would be a great empty plane of existence without significance. Without question, the expression of emotion is a very large part of being human. Thus spoke Bear, Connors, and Paradiso in their introduction to neuroscience exploring the brain. There was a James Lange theory of emotion many, many years ago. William James and Carl Lange proposed that we experience emotion in responses to the physiological changes in our body. For example, we feel sad because we cry, rather than we cry because we are sad. Suppose you're boiling with anger, try to strip away the physiological changes associated with the emotions. Your pounding heart calms, your tense muscles relax, and your flushed face cools. It's hard to imagine you being angry anymore. There is thus a close relationship between emotion and its physiological manifestations, and it's not obvious what causes what. Canon Bard, on the other hand, proposed that at the very least, emotional experience can occur independently of emotional expression. He demonstrated that after a spinal cord transection, even though sensation was eliminated, the animal continued to experience emotions. He also argued that the physiological changes associated with emotion, for example, the increased heart rate, increased sweating, and inhibited digestion, were not exclusive to fear and could not possibly cause fear. So, in a sense, this theory was quite the opposite of the James Lange theory. And therefore, we have two different theories. And if you're watching the visual guide to this podcast, you will see that there is a stimulus. You perceive the stimulus. In the one theory, you experience fear, and then that leads to an emotional expression response, which is both somatic, bodily, and visceral. On the other hand, in the other theory, you experience the somatic visceral response, and that leads to fear. Chicken or egg, what causes emotions? Do emotions cause bodily expression? Do bodily expressions cause emotion? I think the jury very often remains out. James Pappas proposed that on the medial wall of our brain, there is an emotion system that links the cortex with the hypothalamus. And he believed that the experience of emotion was determined by the activity in the cingulate cortex and less directly in other cortical areas. And the Pappas circuit, as we call it, and if you're watching the visual guide, you'll see this, connects the cingulate cortex with the hippocampus, which is the center of your memory, the hypothalamus, which is responsible for emotional expression, the anterior nucleus of the thalamus, and goes back to the cingulate cortex. The If you cut your brain in half right in the middle, the Pappas circuit is what exists. It was Paul MacLean who popularized the concept of a limbic system, the evolution of which enabled animals to experience and express emotions, emancipating them from the stereotypic behavior that comes from just having a brain stem. And MacLean famously said in 1990 that the history of evolution of the limbic system is the history of evolution of the mammals, while the history of evolution of the mammals is the history of evolution of the family. Emotions, therefore, have a great role to play in the evolution of humankind. And if you look at how the brain has evolved from the reptilian to the paleo-mammalian, when we first had a limbic system, to the neo-mammalian as we are today, there is a huge evolution of this particular part of the brain and its connections to the rest of the brain, the cortex in particular. Now, we have a structure called the amygdala, which lies at the pole of the temporal lobe, just below the cortex on the medial side, and it is a complex of nuclei. Afferent connections to the amygdala come from all the sensory systems, each with a projective pattern. And when you disconnect the amygdala or remove it, you get fearlessness. On the other hand, when you stimulate the amygdala, you get increased vigilance or attention. And indeed, when you stimulate the lateral part of the amygdala, you get fear and violent aggression. The amygdala, therefore, is a very important part as an emotional center in our brain. And if you're watching the visual guide, you will see this section of the brain, and the green circle dictate shows us which is the amygdalo-hippocampal complex, and that the amygdala is composed of multiple subnuclei is something that we have become aware of over the decades. Very interestingly, if you disconnect the temporal lobes in a rhesus monkey, as Heinrich Kluwer and Paul Busey showed, the monkey demonstrates various characteristics. Psychic blindness, the ability to see but not recognize, is one of them. Oral tendencies to place each object in their mouth is the other. Hypermetamorphosis, not being able to pay attention, running around, touching every object, placing it in the mouth is the third. Hypersexuality, a striking increase in sexual interests and activities, including masturbation, homosexual, and heterosexual acts, is the fourth. A lack of fear regarding any approaching object that should evoke fear in a monkey, for example, a snake, is a fifth. So, in a sense, parts of the brain that have to do with emotion, when tampered with or interfered with, do lead to aberrant emotions. And as the cartoon on the visual guide shows, this entire pathway is extremely responsible for how humans are kept safe as well. So, when your eyes see a snake, the information goes through the thalamus to your visual cortex, which is in the back of your head and the back of your brain. And from there, pathways take the information to your limbic system, especially the amygdala. And this is what causes you to have the fight, flight, or freeze response. So, memory, emotion, recognition, these things are very important aspects of human emotion. Now, we come to the meat of what we are talking about. Having talked about emotion, we come to the meat of what we are talking about, which is happiness. What does Wikipedia, our sort of online guide, say about happiness? Happiness is a state of mind or feeling characterized by contentment, love, satisfaction, pleasure, or joy. A variety of philosophical, religious, psychological, and biological approaches have striven to define happiness and identify its sources, says Wikipedia. Now, philosophers and religious thinkers often define happiness in terms of living a good life or flourishing rather than simply as an emotion. Happiness, in this older sense, was used to translate the Greek eudaimonia and is still used in the whole area of virtue ethics. Positive psychology researchers, on the other hand, use theoretical models that include describing happiness as consisting of positive emotions and positive activities, or that describe three kinds of happiness: pleasure, engagement, and meaning. Research has identified a number of attributes that correlate with happiness: relationships and social interaction, extraversion, marital status, employment, health, democratic freedom, optimism, religious involvement or spiritual involvement, income, and proximity to other happy people. Happiness economics suggests that the measures of public happiness should be used to supplement more traditional economic measures when evaluating the success of public policy. Now, positive emotions are a very important part of us feeling happy. And there is today a convergence of evidence to suggest that various regions of the limbic system, including and especially the ventral striatal dopaminergic systems, are implemented in an anticipatory, appetitive, positive affective state. So, your dopamine is very important for happiness. Dopamine pathways exist in the front of your brain, and dopamine pathways create, when activated, create an anticipatory state which evokes happiness. And these connect the parts of the brainstem with the nucleus accumbens and the prefrontal cortex, as the visual guide shows. The concentration of dopaminergic neurons in our brain are the reward system that drive motivated behaviors necessary for the survival of the self and the species. Extroverts and risk takers seem to have a more active dopaminergic system. And therefore, happiness and positive emotions may have a lot to do with dopamine and other brain hormones. And again, in the visual guide, the pathways in red and green are the dopaminergic pathways arising from the brainstem and going to the front of the brain or the prefrontal cortex. But happiness is also about genes. There is the G, small u, large u of happiness. Life is about producing genes, G, and providing a proximal umbrella, smaller case u, and a general umbrella, a larger case u, for them, the goo of happiness, to ensure their survival, propagation, and thriving. Two additional functions have evolved in most living organisms to accompany the G function and provide umbrella like protection against adversity. One is local improvement, what's called improvement of the microenvironment through the proximal umbrella, to provide short term protection to G until reproduction and immediate protection to progeny after reproduction. The other is global improvement or of the macro environment, the general umbrella, to provide long term protection to G and multiple generations of progeny. And therefore, there are both micro and macro steps that ensure happiness, not just for one, but for one's progeny. G with a favorable small u and large u has increased chances of surviving and propagating in the long term. And the two U's may actually explain altruism in general, self sacrifice for extended kin in particular. Happiness, therefore, is about achieving the G, smaller case u, and uppercase U objectives. Some of the benchmarks are hardwired, especially in regards to G, and some are environmentally determined, especially in regards to U. So, if you think about it, there are genes that drive happiness. There is a proximal umbrella which influences your microenvironment, you, your immediate family. There is a distal or larger umbrella that influences your community, your society, your extended family. And all three become important in the pursuit of happiness. As an organism ages, levels of happiness tend to increase as more and more of the objectives of the G, little u, and big U are achieved. There is also an inheritance of happiness. For example, genetic studies have shown that volunteers who had inherited two copies of the long variant of the 5-HTT-LPR gene, one that controls the transport of mood affecting neurotransmitter serotonin, showed clear avoidance of negative images such as fierce animals and a clear preference for positive ones such as puppies. People with this variant combination are dubbed LL carriers. The effect wasn't seen in volunteers with at least one version of the short variant of the same gene. These people showed no strong preference, whatever the content of the images. And what this tells us, therefore, is that your genetic makeup is, in particular, the kind of genes that influence happiness chemicals in you, like serotonin, are particularly important in your tendency to be happy, in your tendency to seek happiness. This particular study that we are talking about, the people with the long variant of the gene did not even recognize unhappy pictures, and they showed a preference for happy pictures, indicating, therefore, their ability to shut out what was not happy. When we look at positive emotions, there is a convergence of evidence today to suggest that various regions of the limbic system, what we were talking about earlier, the Papez circuit, for example, especially the ventral striatal dopaminergic systems, which start there and go towards your prefrontal cortex, are implemented in an anticipatory positive affective state. Dopamine independent mechanisms, which use opiate and GABA receptors in all these areas, are important in elaborating states of consummatory happiness, sensory pleasure, and also the release of various neuropeptides that mediate homeostatic satisfactions. The hypothalamus in our brain maintains the set point, a unique and fixed status quo in each person's body. The hypothalamus integrates internal and external information so that it can send out appropriate signals to control your response to a specific situation. As part of the limbic system, it's also responsible for emotional processing and learning, and a variety of brain structures play a role in this. The emotional processing and the learning, including the amygdala or the fear center, which we talked about, and the nucleus accumbens, which I showed you a picture of, or the pleasure center. In patients undergoing brain surgery, researchers have shown that when you stimulate the nucleus accumbens, for example, through which the dopamine pathways flow, you can induce the patient to smile. You can also induce people to have feelings of joy or mirth so that they actually feel happy. And therefore, the experience of emotions and the expressions of emotions, especially positive emotions, comes from through these dopamine pathways, originates in the limbic system, and it is mediated via the frontal cortex in your brains. And if you look at the visual guide, you will see again a picture of the pathways that are involved. This other picture in the visual guide is just to show you that various neurotransmitters are extremely important in the monitoring and expression of human emotions, and these include serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. What we do know is that too little of them can result in clinical depression, what we call inappropriate unhappiness. We also know that other hormones like endorphins and enkephalins, the body's natural analgesics, contribute to a positive effect through mood elevation that we get, for example, after exercise. And together, these signals link the limbic brain to the neocortex and have a profound effect on our highs and lows. To some extent, we need to understand that the concentration of dopaminergic neurons in our brain are the reward system that drive motivated behaviors necessary for the survival of the self or species. And interestingly, extroverts and risk takers seem to have a more active dopaminergic system. We also know that serotonin is important. It modulates the generation and regulation of emotion and mood. And in healthy volunteers, a transient reduction of serotonergic transmission by means of depleting tryptophan in the diet has been associated with mood lowering. Again, the visual guide shows you the pathways in the brain. The serotonin pathway is in blue, the dopamine pathways are in red and green. What about happiness and society? In social cognitive neuroscience, we know that fairness and cooperation are rewarding. To motivate consumers or employees, corporations offer monetary incentives such as cashback deals or salary bonuses. However, human behavior is not solely driven by material outcome. Fairness and equity matter as well. In a neuroimaging study reported in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, fair offers led to higher happiness ratings and increased activity in several reward regions of the brain compared with unfair offers of equally monetary value. Other neuroimaging studies have similarly shown activation in reward regions in response to cooperative partners or cooperative play. It therefore seems to be not just having a reward, the fairness of the reward and cooperation that the rewards bring about seem to be even more important. What about things like pleasure, and what about addiction? Pleasure is a complex neurobiological phenomenon which is relying on reward circuitry or limbic activity, again, relying on dopaminergic signaling as well as endorphins. Natural rewarding activities are necessary for survival, and appetitive motivation usually governs beneficial biological behaviors like eating, sex, and reproduction. So we do more of something because we feel rewarded by it. And feeling rewarded creates a sense of anticipation, making us want to do the same thing again and again and again. So, that sense of reward, that sense of anticipation is what leads to pleasure seeking by us and what leads to what we call normally pleasurable activity. Social contacts can further facilitate the positive effects exerted by pleasurable experiences. Artificial stimulants, on the other hand, can be detrimental since they do deteriorate flexibility and normal control of behavior. Addictive drugs, on the other hand, can actually directly act on our reward pathways. And interestingly, digital media has the capacity to activate very similarly reward systems in our brain. So, how do the taste of chocolate, winning money, a pretty face, musical peak experiences, sexual arousal, and orgasmic pleasure all cause happiness? All of the studies report arousals, especially involving the orbitofrontal, anterior cingulate, and insular cortices in the brain. And of course, it is this extension of the limbic system and its involvement of these other pathways leading to the frontal lobe that seems to be extremely important, not just in the experience of pleasure, but also in the cognitive memories that are associated with those states. Does happiness have anything to do with your left or right brain, you may ask? And of course, when you go back to the epilepsy study or studies of Baer and Fedio, for example, which I have quoted in previous podcasts, left brain dominant individuals tend to be more ideological and philosophical in their approach, more motivated by social and pragmatic rather than emotional concerns, more diligent, purposeful, capable of greater tenacity, and driven more often by a sense of duty. Right brain dominant people, on the other hand, have a better appreciation of the world around them, greater creative ability, a proclivity for the finer aspects of life, and tend to be more mood and emotion driven in making their choices, both day to day ones and those that are self defining. Not surprisingly, therefore, the ability to feel happiness at higher order levels perhaps is right brained, and the seeking of happiness also perhaps may be more a right brain rather than a left brain activity. The locus of control also makes has a role to play in happiness. An internal locus of control, where a person feels in control of his circumstances, is protective of emotional stress and will enhance your happiness. An external locus of control, being controlled by one's circumstances, makes one vulnerable for emotional stress. True happiness lies in being able to self actualize. And of course, when one goes back to the Maslow's hierarchy of social needs, we all have physical needs first. We then have security needs, financial and occupational. We then have social needs, which include love, care, and affection. We have ego needs, self esteem, dignity, social acceptance. And when we achieved all of these to a certain level, we then feel that we are self actualizing. Self actualization is a higher order sense of happiness and positive emotions that most people feel. And in that state of mind, when you talk to someone, you're often able to say, "How are you?" And they would say, "Oh, it couldn't be better. I'm doing very well." And I think that is a very important marker of happiness as well. Our earlier podcast talked about Jiddu Krishnamurti and his transformation. And that, of course, that kind of enlightenment is something that could lead to what one would consider eternal happiness, which, of course, is not the core of today's talk, but I think worth considering. It's therefore quite hard to separate the psychological from the physiological components that drive happiness. But what we do know is that even when you engage in a process like behavior therapy, your brain changes in response. Think about it. Behavior therapy is purely a psychological process of engagement that you do with a professional. Yet, your brain has the capacity to change in the way that it is wired, in the way that it expresses these chemicals and hormones in response to such therapy. And that tells you how plastic your brain really is. These processes can operate below the conscious level and can may not necessarily be entirely subconscious, and that is what perhaps gives us an advantage over lower species because we have more cortical control over the reward pathway. Happiness is under the brain's subconscious control because emotional states are important for regulating behaviors in general. And emotions and positive emotions are extremely important for the survival of species. They are important to ensure that you eat, drink, sleep properly, have sex, and do all the things that people need to do in order to survive, thrive, and propagate. And the brain, therefore, uses and depends on our emotions to make sure of it. A highly motivated state of positive effect, and people who are risk takers or highly motivated seem to be happier in general, is what most happiness researchers point out. So, is happiness in the brain or is it in your mind? As I've tried to point out today, there clearly are critical brain structures associated with happiness, but it may not necessarily be a cause effect relationship. Simulating happiness is not really the same as being happy, and while both the substrates and the effects may be in the brain, the mechanisms to happiness, the pathway to happiness, may be under our conscious control. And therefore, perhaps we can all be happy if we put our minds to it. What are the keys to happiness? Adequate neurohormones, dopamine, serotonin, endorphins, seem to be important. Adequate cerebral arousal, especially the orbitofrontal, anterior cingulate, and insular cortices, the parts of the human brain connecting the emotional brain to your social brain, your executive brain, seem to be extremely important. Activity that arouses these systems, activity that is normally rewarding and pleasurable, is extremely important. Activity that inspires society, fairness, altruism, and striving for social good is also clearly important. So, do think of an activity that you find pleasurable. Think equally at the same time of a social cause that you find motivating. What is the difference in the happiness that they give to you? If going to a bar and having a drink with friends, or going out with friends and, say, rescuing a puppy that needs rescuing, both give you happiness. Really, there is no difference in what's happening within you when you engage in those activities. There are some happy people qualities, therefore. Happy people usually have high self esteem, they think well of themselves. Happy people have a good internal locus of control, they experience a sense of personal control. Happy people tend to be optimistic about the future. They look at the future with positivism. The consensus of evidence seems to be that happy people tend to be extroverted. They seek other people out, they seek to communicate, they seek human relationships. All these seem to define human happiness. Having reviewed all this, let's look at this a little philosophically. How can one be happy in an adversarial world? And for this, I go back to Paulo Coelho. His Warriors of the Light is a beautiful book, a page a day book, which talks about how you navigate life with all its complexities. He points out that you sometimes have to behave like water. You flow around the obstacles that you encounter. You have to be wise. You do not talk about your defeats or the many injustices in the world all the time. You have to be aware of your immense strength. Never fight with anyone who does not deserve the honor of combat. You have to trust other people because, first and foremost, that means that you have to trust yourself. You have to have memories, but you must learn to separate the useful from the unnecessary. You must learn to dispose of your emotional rubbish. And of course, when someone really wants something, the whole universe conspires in their favor. You could have Freudian blinding positivism that Freud talked about. The man who told his wife, "If one of us should die, I think I would go and live in Paris." And that, of course, is not essentially the key to happiness. In sum, happiness may well be in the right attitude. Life is a pudding full of plums. Take it as it comes.